Hello everyone, and welcome to the next installment of Wrestling with RahXephon. As was the case with the previous episode, this one will be dedicated to another character. In this case, we're going to go with another safe character, and that one being of Dr. Itsuki Kisaragi. Now, quick note, when I say safe character, I mean a character that is both relevant to the plot and or lore of RahXephon, and has some level of consistent characterization or a character arc. I specify this because, as mentioned in the opening video of this series, RahXephon's cast is one of its weakest aspects, and a lot of members do kind of pick and choose between either being relevant to the plot and or lore, and or being fully fleshed out and developed. It is an issue that some of the characters here feel that they're only here for plot reasons, and some of them are super developed, but don't necessarily feel relevant to the plot. Itsuki Kisaragi, however, doesn't necessarily have this issue, as he does feel both relevant to the lore and plot, and is relatively consistently characterized, while also having something of a character arc. He is the science guy of the cast. He is the scientist which officially studies music, but unofficially also delves into the mysteries of the RahXephon system, and just does general science stuff. He comes off as a bit of an odd loner when we first meet him, although he does live with his quote-unquote sister Quan. Although as the series progresses, we do learn more about Itsuki, and we do see that he is not a complete inhuman loner. In fact, he does have something of a repentant arc that kind of mirrors that of our previous character, Commander Kunigi. Opening with Itsuki's place in the plot, as mentioned earlier, he is the scientist guy of the Terra base. He studies things, he does research, he seems pretty smart, and he seems to know more than everyone else, at least a lot of the time. When we first meet him in episode 5, and for his early appearances, he just does kind of general science person stuff. He puts Ayato through the scanners, he gives some exposition, he does research into the RahXephon. We also learn that he is a failed instrumentalist when Makoto has him put on this VR helmet and attempt to create a shield with RahXephon. This hints at some of mysterious heritage, although that isn't fully fleshed out until episode 15, which delves into his childhood along with Makoto and Helena, and a few other bits and pieces revealed here and there. While he is the first person that kind of opens up to Ayato, it doesn't feel natural at this point, and he maintains this kind of air of distance until he does seem to get more emotionally involved in the story when the Babbitt Foundation does come to claim Quan for their own upon her quote-unquote awakening. This sees him start to shift from a creepy weirdo to a repentant and responsible weirdo. You see, Quan has lived as Itsuki's quote-unquote adopted sister. He calls her his sister, even though I'm pretty sure that she's actually his mother, technically speaking. And this really is what starts to set Itsuki down a path of repentance in a sort of way. The Foundation claims Quan as her own, even though Itsuki has been actively lying about her having any kind of awakening and actively trying to protect her and keep her away from the Foundation. This doesn't succeed, however, and it does lead to Itsuki expressing some emotional vulnerability and acting out in inappropriate ways, most notably trying to reconcile with his ex Haruka in a very awkward and uncomfortable scene. They did date previously, although it also didn't work out previously. After this point, Itsuki realizes that he can't control others and thus decides to facilitate Ayato's journey to Tokyo Jupiter along with Quan, whom he asks to be protected by Ayato. Upon the return of Ayato and Quan, Itsuki is still the scientist guy and just generally gives mission briefings and has some heart-to-hearts with Ayato, telling him that he understands what it's like to kind of be a failure, which kind of constitutes a lot of his character. More on that later. Oh yeah, and he's also Ayato's brother. But, as the series starts to wrap up, Itsuki evacuates along with the rest of the Terra staff after the commander sacrifices himself to take out a big Mu ship, and in the final 2 episodes is in the church along with Lord Babbitt, almost shooting Helena, instead gets stabbed by his former assistant, and dies side by side with her in the church steeple. However, it is important to note that all of this is, of course, undone by the reset at the end of the series. Now, I gave a very general summary because Itsuki doesn't necessarily exercise his own agency enough to manifest any concrete action. And Itsuki's kind of all over the place with his interactions. Sometimes he seems kind of coy, sometimes he seems to be very open and self-loathing, sometimes he kind of just seems mildly annoyed, or a lot of the time he seems to be mildly depressed. And I think this depression stems from Itsuki being a quote-unquote failure. Now, Objectively, he is probably more successful, but in terms of what he was created to do, i.e. be an instrumentalist, he's not, so he's a failure, and I don't know if him becoming the scientist guy of Terra was the plan B, so it's hard for me to tell if he's either annoyed or depressed because he didn't succeed at being an instrumentalist, or because he's continuously strung along by the group which assigned him a purpose at birth. Or even if he can't get over Haruka. And this idea also extends to his social interactions, where he has a weird, uncomfortable dynamic with Haruka, having been dumped by her, another failure of his, if you will, and he generally doesn't necessarily interact with others very well, even though it seems like he's kind of understands how to do it and he's competent at it. Itsuki's biggest issue, or what he deals with the most, what his arc is kind of focused upon, is the idea of failure. Because while Itsuki is very intelligent, he does seem to be an expert in most of the things he talks about, and he does seem to be relatively sociable, like he's competent at it, he's still considered a quote-unquote failure. As one of the clones who probably didn't fill out what he was supposed to, in this case either serving as another body for Lord Babbitt or becoming an actual instrumentalist, Itsuki lives under the cloud of being a failure, despite the fact that objectively, at least compared to, our normal societal baseline, he would be considered successful. And this failure and how he processes it defines his entire character. It leads to both his initial entrance as a creepy loner, and it feeds into his later characterization of being a repentant, I don't want to say loser, but person, I guess, of someone who lives in a near constant state of what I would say is mild regret. He doesn't quite hate himself, but he doesn't like himself. He has done many things in his life that many of us will not do, but he still hasn't done what he's supposed to have done. And he still seems relatively respected and intelligent, but he doesn't necessarily seem respected by himself, and he's definitely not content with his place in life. While he does have a moral compass, and this does prevent him from falling into a complete moral morass, like, say, Makoto, it doesn't prevent him from feeling the pain of being a quote-unquote failure. And while this pain does eventually lead to him coming full circle and basically telling everyone we need to calm down and try to be more respectful and everything, it doesn't necessarily manifest in any concrete action. While he does start to awaken emotionally with Kwan's disappearance because he loves her as a sister, he doesn't really do anything other than facilitate Ayato's escape to Tokyo Jupiter with Kwan. Likewise, this lack of agency that he seems to show defines his character as one which, again, is still stuck in this feeling of inability, I guess you would say. If I had to use a word to define Itsuki's character, it would be pathetic. I think it's done on purpose to show that someone could have all these great abilities or powers or be smarter than everyone else in the room, but it doesn't matter if they don't use their skills or abilities. Itsuki can do stuff, but he rarely does so wholeheartedly enough to get consistently good results. He has internalized this idea of him being a failure, even though again, objectively I wouldn't consider him one, and as such is grown to basically hold himself back, regardless of what those around him do. Now, he does obviously care for Kwan as a sister, I guess, even though I think she's actually his mother. So it is obvious that he's not actually a complete loner or a psychopath or anything like that. It's just that he doesn't necessarily know how to express or exercise emotional bonds quite normally or healthily. And it must be commented on that he needs to get over Haruka already. Although, for reference, Haruka also needs to get over Ayato. It's been over 10 years, come on. He does seem to be rather distant due to a sense of, or fear of loss, as his childhood was quite regimented, and one which saw the two people he was growing up with become a complete sociopath after extensive bullying, in Makoto's case, or B, an entitled weirdo who's also a complete sociopath. In this case, that would be his other compatriot of Helena. Now, as someone with a moral compass, Itsuki doesn't want to be like either of these two, and has just kind of voluntarily demoted himself to be a loser with a conscience, I guess you would say. And in this way, of the three clones, I would actually consider him the most successful, as he didn't throw his own life away for a cause that was assigned to him at birth. While Makoto spent his entire life trying to prove that D-clones aren't worthless and ended up basically throwing his life away because this led to his downfall due to Operation Downfall, and while Helena literally threw her life away, giving her body to be inhabited by Lord Babbitt's soul, Itsuki kind of just withdraws from the obligations impressed upon him and decides that, yep, I failed, but I'm gonna fail my way. And in this way, his character is kind of respectable, because While his resignation still leads him to throwing away/wasting his life, at least it's in a more passive manner that isn't actively destroying other people's lives. In that way, he is shown to have a much stronger moral compass than either of his compatriots that he grew up with, and this is also a good way for him to assert individuality from that group, and individuality in general. However, while he does express individuality, he never necessarily exercises enough of it, or at least enough of his own agency, to truly make a fate he would like. And in that way, I think Itsuki is a cautionary character. He's one of those characters that is clearly intentioned for the viewer to look at and say, I don't know if I want to be like that guy. Because while he does have great ability, and while he is very intelligent, he's looked at as both a failure by his fellow clones, and to some extent, I would say probably some of the viewers too, because while I understand Itsuki's place as a repentant defector, I guess, I also think that there is some level of nuance to how withdrawn the character is written, and how little he actually does. The character does seem to loathe himself to some extent, and I think that's intentional, and it's showing us that while doing your own thing is good, and while it is important to express your individuality and your moral compass, you must do so consistently if you actually want to shape your own fate to one you'd like. The fact that he still kind of goes along with things does show lack of urgency or agency on his part, and it is a cautionary statement against simply resigning oneself to whatever may be. And that's what I really took away from Itsuki. It is possible to simultaneously repent and feel bad for something, but also not necessarily do much about it and kind of continue to fail. And in this way, I think he's a very cautionary character and different from Kuniki, where Kuniki basically went all in and sacrificed himself in an attempt to redeem himself. Itsuki kind of just wallows about, and while he does have a moral awakening, I guess you could say, it doesn't necessarily translate into any big actions, and as such the character is swept away with everyone else when things beyond his control, things which he kind of allowed to happen, to be honest, consumes him and the world around him.